Hello everyone, welcome to this lecture titled Globalization in a Historical and Global Context. This lecture is part of your paper on media and globalization. This lecture will make you familiar with globalization both as a phenomenon and also as a concept. This presentation, however, will not take a stand on the great debate on the merits and demerits of globalization, but merely try to put it in perspective. Now let's try to understand globalization a little more closely. During the last 3 decades, the word globalization has gained tremendous currency in India. There has been a great concern with it in the media, academia, political circles, and among the non-government organizations. The concerns have taken both the forms of endorsement as well as denigration. There have often been derogatory references made to it. At the same time, it has been projected as a boon and a solution to India's major problems. The responses to globalization constitute a fairly large range. There is no doubt that all these responses were triggered by the new economic policies adopted by the Indian government in 1991. That was the time when the liberalization movement started in India more clearly. These new economic policies sought to loosen the government control on economy and also create conditions for the integration of Indian economy with the global economy. However, it is important to keep in mind that the phenomenon of globalization is neither purely Indian nor of a recent origin, nor confined to the economic sphere only. It is much older, truly global in dimension, and covers not just economy, but virtually every aspect of human life. Globalization has brought about changes in the realm of market, trade and finance, communication and media, technology and science, mobility and migration, and intercultural transactions. Now, let us look into the historical part of it. At an elementary level, globalization refers to an integration and coming together of different parts of the world. A globalized world is a connected world. Phrases like global village, networked society, post-industrial society, age of the information revolution, all these are often used to make sense of the word globalization. The truly revolutionary dimension of globalization can be grasped better by making a distinction between the phenomenon and the discourse. This involves raising 2 different questions. One, which concrete set of developments does globalization refer to? 2, how old is it? In other words, what is the history, or rather prehistory, of the phenomenon called globalization? At the level of discourse, it would be safe to say that the term began to be used in the sense of resembling its current usage since the 1930s, for instance. However, its usage has gained currency during the closing decades of the 20th and the early decades of the 21st century. The question, how old it is or how old is it, is much more difficult to answer. It pertains to the temporal dimension of the phenomenon. In general, by globalization we mean a world that is integrated and interconnected in complex, in contradictory ways. A world of new networks and institutions which have cast their shadow on the flows of goods, services, ideas, technologies, cultural forms, and people's lives in general, cutting across national boundaries. If this is a valid understanding of globalization, when exactly did such a world start emerging and taking shape? Well, it may be necessary to comment on the temporal dimension of globalization by making a distinction between the actual occurrence of the phenomenon and its history or prehistory. It would be fairly uncontentious to say that the modern industrial economy, or in other words, capitalism, reached a definite, qualitatively different stage during the post-World War period and started throwing up powerful systems, both cultural and political, that can be grouped together under the rubric called globalization. However, since the stages of industrialism cannot be separated so neatly, it would be possible to see the cluster of institutions associated with globalization in the earlier periods also. The question thus arises, how far back one can take the history of globalization? The story of the integration of the world can be seen as consisting of three different stages. Well, the first major integration of the world occurred during the end of the 16th century, when the discovery of America by Columbus and the discovery of a new sea route to the east by Vasco da Gama by resounding of the Cape of Good Hope at the southern tip of Africa connected different parts of the world together. These two discoveries initiated an unprecedented process of global trade that connected continents of America, Europe, Asia, Africa, and of course Australia. The global trade was also accompanied by the great migration of people across the continents. 13 million slaves from Africa were forcibly brought and settled in America. These developments altered the ethnic profile of the world. The extent of integration that happened during this phase can be understood by the example of, for instance, sugar. Around the 17th and 18th centuries, sugar started being manufactured in the Americas at the initiative of the Europeans with the help of slave labor acquired from the African coast and added to coffee obtained from Western Asia and tea from Eastern Asia to be ultimately consumed by the aristocracy in Europe. The extent of integration and connectivity achieved during the 16th to 18th centuries was truly unprecedented, and it was driven primarily by trade. The second stage of integration began towards the end of the 18th century. A technological revolution, generally known as the Industrial Revolution, created unprecedented levels of affluence, albeit only in certain European pockets. The Industrial Revolution gave rise to phenomena such as imperialism and colonialism, under which almost all of non-European world came under direct political and economic domination of some European countries. The world got further integrated, and the European philosophers openly began to talk about the presence of one single world. The new world that emerged as a result of the technological revolutions had three major features. One, that it had achieved levels of affluence like never before. Two, it was internally integrated and connected like never before. And three, it had a distinct domination profile. It was a vertical world in which Europe was at the apex. So the new world was integrated, affluent, and hierarchical. All these features developed further in the 20th century when the development of modern industrial economy, constituting the third stage of global integration. It has been argued that the second half of the 20th century has experienced new technological changes that are qualitatively different. The new technological breakthroughs have created satellite communication system, the internet, the global networks. These have created new connectivities and have affected virtually every facet of human life. These developments have tended to bond distinct groups and communities into a single global society. It is in this set of developments that are generically referred to as globalization. Well, having discussed the historical background of globalization, let us now go into the details of this phenomenon in our next discussion. Well, the term globalization has a strong conceptual resemblance with another term often used in social sciences, that is called modernity. The two do not have an identical meaning, but they are not wholly distinct from each other. We can perhaps understand globalization better by focusing on modernity and looking at it as a particular stage in the unfolding of modernity. What is the idea of modernity then? Modernity is used in the sense of a big break or a rupture in the history of humanity that occurred towards the end of the 18th century, as referred to in the discussion that we have done. It is generally assumed that world history prior to that period was marked more by continuity rather than change. Big changes, whenever they occurred during the agrarian age, were more in degree than, of course, in kind. Then there was a big break in the 18th century. So powerful and pervasive was this break that it set in motion a process of transformation of the world. The rest of the story of the history of the world since the 18th century is essentially the unfolding of the forces unleashed during the end of the 18th century. Globalization is integrally connected to this transformation and it represents an important phase of this transformation. Therefore, upon this view, the history of the world proceeded along with the axis of continuity, disturbed by a big break towards the end of the 18th century, followed by a transformation which was neither local, that is confined to some pockets of the world, nor temporary, that is continuing only for a fixed duration before stabilizing. Rather, it was global in nature, and it has been happening continuously since then. As an outgrowth of the process that we just mentioned, it began to be noticed that the last few decades of the 20th century began to experience new changes. These changes could be identified as a new phase of techno-capitalism, marked by a new synthesis of capital and technology, in which knowledge and information played a much more decisive role than before. Just as the earlier phases were marked by the domination of trade and capital, the new phase was marked by the domination of knowledge and information. It was this new phase that began to be identified as globalization. Let us now look at some of the features of this phenomenon called globalization. First, a revolution in communication technology is creating global connectivities in a very short time. The new technologies also took much less time in getting diffused to all parts of the world, as we have seen in this country also. Second, much greater accumulation and circulation of finance capital at the global scale, a search for new markets, labor, and other resources leading to much greater mobility. And third, homogenization of consumer products and therefore also consumer taste, preferences, and behavior. The homogenization that happens both at the level of commodities and culture also. Fourth, a tremendous enlargement of the scope of electronic media through telephony, television, fax, email, internet. These began to create what has been called a globally networked society. These developments have serious implications for the traditional notions of the sovereignty of state systems. 5. Unprecedented movement of human population to and from all parts of the world for various purposes was a significant mobility. This creates social implications for culture, diaspora, and identity politics. On the one hand, it creates a homogenization of cultures by bringing them together. On the other hand, it also produces acute cultural anxieties and resentment against outsiders, in particular and the forces of globalization in general. Douglas Kellner, a leading scholar of globalization, has summarized the phenomenon for us in these words. I quote, "Globalization points to a new configuration of capitalist society in which technical and scientific knowledge, computerization and automation of labor, and information technology and multimedia play a role in the process of production analogous to the function of human labor power, mechanization of the labor process, and machines in an earlier era of capitalism. This process is generating novel modes of societal organization, forms of culture and everyday life, conflicts and modes of struggle," unquote. It would thus appear that globalization as an idea stands at the intersection of important changes and continuities. The continuities would link it to the development of capitalism and its integrative global scenario since the beginning of the 19th century. It's also important to recognize that since the 1960s, when the first satellite went into the space, a new phase in the development of capitalism may be marked. Well, most of the features that are generally associated with globalization are connected to the phase of techno-capitalism. Now let us look at the contradictions of globalization. For a better understanding of globalization, two disclaimers would be necessary. One, economy and technology may be at the root of globalization, but the phenomenon of globalization should not be reduced only to its economic dimension. It should be recognized as a social, political, and a cultural phenomenon, and along with an economic one. And the second, we need to avoid seeing it either as a blessing or as a curse. While evaluating its role, we need to avoid the pitfalls of either endorsement or denigration. Instead, it's necessary to adopt a critical approach which would focus on both the positive and negative features, and moreover, would see the two as interconnected. That is very important. In fact, the two are so intertwined that it's not possible to separate one from the other. Now let us look at some of the contradictory features of globalization. First, it is true that under the impact of new changes, the state systems have emerged as more powerful than even before. Modern technologies of war and destruction, greater bureaucratization, technologies of control and surveillance have all rendered modern states extremely powerful and interventionist. At the same time, there has also been empowerment of the people in general. A large number of protests have been organized against the states, and people from different parts of the world have been mobilized in these protests. Second, that while on the one hand there has been a much greater bureaucratic centralization made possible by the technology of surveillance, at the same time there has also been a decentralization as a result of the internet, flows of information, and access of modern technology to more and more people. Third, unifications and divisions have happened simultaneously. Globalization unifies as well as it divides. The technologies of information, communication, and transportation have united populations across the globe. But new and powerful divisions have also been created. New solidarities have been forged under globalization. But globalization has also created a digital divide of the haves and the have-nots, rich and the poor. Those who have access to new information technology have a clear edge over those who do not. The surveys have shown that the new divide has a propensity to cut across all the previous social divides based on gender, race, religion, and class. And this new division is a very serious one. So the new indicator of privilege is not so much heredity or wealth, as was the case earlier, but computer training, literacy, access to information technology. Fourth, the enemies of globalization are also the products of globalization. This became amply clear on 11 September 2001 in Newark, when the citadel of globalization and the apex of global power was demolished by terrorists using the same technologies and networks that had helped establish the forces of globalization. The major attack on globalization happened by making use of the devices created by globalization itself. Fifth, on the one hand, free trade and social and cultural exchanges engendered by globalization have brought greater democratization. On the other hand, denial of democratic possibility has also happened under and because of globalization. There has been greater violence, destruction, and terrorism under these. Sixth, on the one hand, the world has emerged as a single global unit and can be truly called a global society. On the other hand, the powerful identities of various kinds have emerged that have created fusions and ruptures. The age of globalization, paradoxically, is also the age of sharpening of identities. A question that may come to your mind at this stage is how to make sense of these contradictory realities of globalization. Well, it is truly an enormously complex and multifaceted phenomenon and can be understood better by making a distinction between globalization from above and globalization from below. The two are not wholly distinct from each other and are perpetually engaged in a dialogical relationship. Globalization from above refers to the enormous expansion of capitalism, particularly in the post-war period characterized by tremendous powers to big corporations, increasing profits, predatory economic practices, media barons, control over entertainment and leisure, greater surveillance, greater intervention of the bureaucratic state in the lives of the people, erosion of privacy, a helplessness of the ordinary people against the judgment of globalization, and loss of cultural forms. In other words, globalization from above means the appropriation of new technologies by both the state systems and large multinational corporations. This is how the opponents of globalization see it. However, this is an incomplete picture which leaves out some important dimensions of globalization. And therefore, to complete this picture, we need to look at globalization from below. Globalization from below refers to how groups and individuals make use of the institutions of globalization to resist the predatory and dominational tendencies of the major vested interests and beneficiaries of globalization. This happens because even as it gives power to big corporations and state systems, globalization also empowers those at the margins through access to global communications and media networks. Globalization can transform local struggles into translocal, even transnational ones, by bringing together similar groups and struggles from different parts. It is in the very nature of globalization that the new technological devices cannot remain confined to the pockets of the political and economic vested interests. If they can be deployed for the purposes of domination from the top, they can also be used to question and challenge the domination. Therefore, it is best to look upon globalization as a contested field which cannot be monopolized by any single agency. Well, this point becomes clear when seen in the context of the relationship between globalization and democracy. It is true that the new techno-capitalism gave rise to a version of democracy that was more of a handmaiden to the big corporates, media barons, and the political superpowers. But globalization from below also supported an alternative imagination of democracy, which questioned the structures of domination and hegemony unleashed by, of course, globalization. The new technological devices, which really constitute the matrix of globalization, have the potentials of both enslavement as well as liberation. This can be understood better with the examples of computers. The first generation of computers consisted of a huge infrastructure which could be maintained and controlled only by the governments, big business, and military establishments. They exemplified a concentration of power and resources. However, within one generation, computers and laptops have become easily available and have now become completely democratized. The centralization of information was soon replaced by a democratization of information through the medium of computers. The internet and the social media today play the role of watchdogs of the predatory tendencies of both the states and the big business houses. Governments try but find it very difficult either to control the information in social media or to restrict the circulation of sensitive information. It is precisely in this sense that globalization has a Janus-like character. One of its arms tries to restrict, control, coerce, and dominate. The other arm resists and struggles against that domination. Both have been successful in varying degrees in this contemporary world. Globalization as a whole is a phenomenon that is both enslaving and liberating. So friends, now let us sum up what we have discussed so far in this presentation. Well, as you recall, that we began with providing an introduction of the term globalization and went on to understand the history or prehistory of the phenomenon. This discussion was followed by an effort to cultivate a conceptual understanding of the term and place it in perspective. Finally, we dealt with inherent contradictions apparent in the unfolding of globalization and looked at what it has to offer to individuals and to groups at the two ends of the spectrum. The points made in this lecture are as follows. At a generic level, globalization refers to a world that is internally connected and well integrated. This integration and connectivity happens at the level of economy, politics, and culture. In short, every facet of human life. A fairly large number of concepts with overlapping meanings have been employed to convey a sense of globalization. We discussed that the globalization as a phenomenon may be located within the matrix of industrialism, modernity, post-industrialism, techno-capitalism, information technology, and so on. A useful distinction may be made between the discourse and the phenomenon. At the level of discourse, the word began to be used broadly in its contemporary sense since the 1930s. The beginning of the phenomenon has been variously seen either since the 1960s or more accurately the closing decades of the 20th century. The history, or rather the prehistory of the phenomenon will take us back to the 16th century. It was since this period that a connected and an integrated world began to change. It was since this period that a connected and an integrated world began to emerge. This integration can be further divided into two phases. During the first phase of 16th to 18th centuries, a global trade began to connect the various continents together. It also initiated a movement of the people across the different continents. During the second phase, that is the end of the 18th century onwards, the new technological breakthroughs brought about an industrial revolution which integrated the world further. The new world that emerged was affluent, integrated, and with a distinct domination structure. However, it was during the post-war period that the new technological initiatives created yet another revolution in the field of knowledge and communication. This is really the motor that drives globalization. The power of globalization has been recognized by both its critics and by its supporters. In other words, both the perspectives, the denigration as well as the endorsement, are united in recognizing the truly revolutionary potentials of globalization. However, it would be useful to avoid the pitfalls of both uncritical endorsement and unselective denigration. It is best to recognize the historical character of globalization. It has been constituted by the history and the gradual unfolding of techno-productive forces, and the last 2 centuries having established itself in the contemporary world, globalization has unleashed very contradictory realities. Centralization and decentralization, coercion from the top and increasing democratization, empowerment at the apex and also at the margins, increasing power of the nation state and dilution of national sovereignty are all integral components of globalization. One way to make sense of these contradictory realities is to make a distinction between globalization from above and globalization from below. Globalization from above represents a concentration and appropriation of all economic, political, and cultural powers by the state system and the corporate world, or the business houses, or the media barons. Globalization from below questions, challenges, and resists this monopoly of all power. We hope that you enjoyed the presentation in this program. For more information, please refer to the e-text and read very carefully and attempt all the questions given at the end. I hope that you enjoyed the program and connect this with the globalization that we have presented in the series. Thank you very much.